I'm David Howard, Head of Dairy Services for Wynnstay.
I am Bryn Hughes, Head of Sheep and Beef for Wynnstay.
Bryn, how would you describe Forage4Profit?
Forage4Profit, David, is something we've put together, really, isn't it? Looking at what we can do really to maximise animal performance on farm. So if you look initially at what you're trying to achieve with the animal, which is generally high growth rates or high milk production, and then what we do then is look at how we can actually achieve that. I suppose the basic elements of it is to make sure that the animal has enough good quality and plenty of quantity of feed at all times. And then looking back a few steps, how do you make sure that that is available on the farm at all times? Forage is the cheapest feed that we have for animals. We're in a green grass growing area of the UK, and it's really important from a sustainability point of view and from a profitability point of view that we make the very most of what grows underneath our feet. So Forage4Profit really is a focus on making sure that we can grow enough good quality feed for those animals in our care.
So you mentioned about soil health, so looking at soil health, and you mentioned about pH being an issue. I read a lot of stuff about the importance of soil compaction, or the issue with soil compaction, that's a big issue. Is that an issue? Do you come across a lot of issues with soil compaction, or is there anything else soil related that people should be mindful of?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to test, David. So once you've done a soil test, it'll give you some indication. There are indicator species of soil compaction or soil acidity. The most important thing you can do in terms of compaction of soil is to actually dig a hole and see what's going on in the soil, and you should have a good structure once you to see within that hole what's going on. But it's a factor sometimes that's overplayed, and there's a lot of machinery being spent to get rid of soil compaction.
Yeah.
So rather than going and spending a lot of money on diesel or machinery, I'd certainly go and buy a spade and dig a hole first and see what's going on.
A bit cheaper as well.
It's a lot cheaper, David. Yeah. But you do have to sweat.
Then a fancy new machine to sort it out. Yeah.
But my starting point always is a good soil test. As I said, we can look at biology, we can look at chemistry, and we can look at the physical side of the soil within the test. Then, when you're walking that ground, you can soon work out whether there's compaction there, and then a spade or a compaction meter gives you a good reading on there. And also when you're walking it as well, you can see what's actually happening with the grass or the crop that's in there as well. So there's, like many things on the farm, it's the farmer's eyes and the farmer's feet that really count, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And, looking at what's going in front of you is important.
Got it. So assuming we've got the soils into the right condition then, we've worked on the soils, we're sort of moving on then, I suppose, to looking at seed selection. And seed selection, I guess it's quite important thinking about A, the seed that goes in the ground, but B, it's what the farmer's trying to achieve at the end. So whether that's producing litres of milk or kilos of beef or kilos of lamb. And is there a relationship then, do you think, between, to give an example, if a guy's producing milk for a cheese contract, we know that certain varieties of maize, high energy, high starch, have a positive effect on milk protein. So again, those farmers possibly should be considering certain varieties of maize that we could recommend to support our requirement for the milk contract. Was there any other examples you can think of how we can link that seed a bit closer to what the end goal of the farmer is?
Yeah, I think most of the crops are grown with an end goal in mind, David, haven't they?
Yeah.
Examples that you've used are good with the maize. I think that forage brassicas have got a big place to play in terms of filling in gaps.
Yeah.
But
gaps such as
you'll have a summer forage gap if it goes dry again, David, won't you?
We've had a couple of dry years, at least 2 or 3 years in a row now.
Yeah, we've had a few dry years, and then the grass runs out of steam in the winter, and then you can grow a crop then for the animals to graze, whether it's kale or fodder beet or whatever. So there's lots of different answers there. I suppose we need to keep a little bit of an eye on, what grows well in your area. Have you got sufficient rainfall? Is the soil type suitable for grazing in the winter? We don't want to cause any kind of soil erosion problems. And there are some novel crops coming up now that will help farmers fill some of these gaps that we've traditionally had.
And what about overwinter? Like again, sort of maize ground over winter. Anything you'd look to in terms of putting something in over the winter?
Yeah, I would, David. Really, I think the maize ground needs to be covered. I think there's plenty of options in terms of westerwolds or ryegrasses that do a reasonable job at covering that ground. So I think it's something that we need to do, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So David, we've successfully grown a forage crop on the farm. From a dairy nutrition point of view, what would be your main focus points afterwards?
So with Forage4Profit then, the focus very much is trying to link those 4 areas together. So assuming we've done the first 3 steps, as you said, it's looking then to sort of like tie that into the what the farmer's trying to achieve. To give you 3 simple examples of balancing diets and nutrition, you mentioned about forage rye as a crop over the winter to go in after maize. That's been one we've had good success with, I think, in recent years. Again, it's a good example of how the 4 areas tied together, because hybrid rye as a crop for dry cows, there's a couple of benefits to it. One, it's low in potassium, so it's a good crop for dry cows for that reason, if you're trying to balance decant diets and so on. It also gives you some bulk. It improves your dry matter output per hectare. And as a crop to grow after maize, it's a good one. It fits in quite well into that.
And that could replace straw.
Yeah, it could replace straw. So again, the standard dry cow ration would have a lot of chopped straw in it, so you've got to get a machine in to chop it, lots of diesel and man hours and so on to do it. But the hybrid rye rations work well because there's no chopping straw. You can make up a ration of hybrid rye grass silage, some minerals and blend to do your dry cow, so that works well. The second point I'd move on to is protein nutrition. So this is an area we've been very much focused on over the last couple of years. For lots of reasons, protein is an expensive part of any ration. So for commercial, economic reasons, we want to be as efficient as what we can. There's a big drive to reducing soya or taking soya out completely by processors and supermarkets. So again, the question of, can we grow, what protein crops can we grow on a farm to make sure that we can balance that with the feed that comes in? So how can we complement the forage plus the purchased feed with respect to protein? Amino acids is something we're looking at. So rather than thinking about crude protein, which we've done for many, many years, it's more looking at the amino acid requirements. So that's something we're very much focused on as well. And the last point I've put down is thinking about rumen additives. Yeast have been around for a lot of years, and we've had good success using yeast. It's a relatively inexpensive investment for the return that it gets. So anything that can help rumen fermentation to get more out of that forage crop and ultimately increase the litres produced or the meat produced from that forage is a good investment. And probably the last thing is methane inhibitors. And again, that's something that we've put a lot of focus on. We've looked at lots of products in the marketplace. Methane is 50% of the carbon footprint of milk. So again, it's another area of nutrition that we're looking at to sort of complete the picture as well.
David, there's a fair bit of pressure on farmers to become more sustainable. I think Forage4Profit is one way that we can help those farmers meet that sustainability goals. Sheep and beef sector has got a reasonable reputation for growing animals off green grass, really. And I think some sectors of the dairy industry have got that thing as well. What would be your key points, David, for a dairy farmer in terms of improving their sustainability kind of credentials, looking at Forage4Profit?
I think probably the key message to start that one is probably, I think from my experience, that the word environmental sustainability and financial sustainability, those two things sort of go hand in hand. So if a farmer's not making any money, then it sort of doesn't work. So we need to achieve financial sustainability as well as environmental sustainability. But I think those two things can be achieved at the same time.
Yeah.
And in terms of sort of like, if I was to give sort of 3 top tips to that, then again, go back to thinking about milk from forage. Every 1,000 litres of milk from forage is 460 kilograms of purchased feed. So if you go from the national average, which we said at the start, which was 2,800, you improve that by 1,000 litres, you've saved yourself 460 kilograms.
Nearly half a ton
per cow. Per cow an hour. So there's a big saving to be made there, as well as a sustainability effect as well. Moving on from that, we mentioned about purchased protein. So protein is an expensive part of dairy rations.
Yeah.
So again, thinking about the types of grass and crops that we're growing at home, focusing on homegrown protein options, whatever they are, is definitely the second bet. And thinking about sort of most protein sources that we use that are imported, like so a lot of rape meal is imported, soy is imported, hence the carbon footprint attached to those products. So it's about making more efficient use of purchased feed, is really the key message there. And probably the final point is on animal welfare. So again, sort of achieving the high quality of forage and a nice balanced ration is only as good as the healthy animal that eats it. So again, focusing in real hard on the controllables. So the controllables in terms of animal welfare is a real important point as well.
Thanks, Dave.